Hey everybody, this is Mr. Herzl. I'm the Social Studies Coordinator at Life Schools, and whether you're here because you're reviewing, you didn't do too good on a former test that you took, or maybe this is your first time here and this is the lecture that your teacher pointed you towards to understand it. Either way, I'm going to help you understand the Jamestown, which became the Virginia colony, and really Chesapeake Society. So let's go ahead and jump right in. It's important to understand why we're looking at these things and what really the state of Texas thinks is important. So when you see these teaks, it'll say in the beginning of almost all of your lectures from here on out, it'll say teaks for this week. It's important to look at those and know what the state of Texas thinks is important, and then really focus in on those things. And your teacher and I are both going to help to do that. So some of these you've already you could have answered from previous lectures, but today we're going to talk about really explaining the significance of 1607 and the founding of Jamestown, economic reasons for colonizing versus the Pilgrims' religious reasons. So the Virginia colony was colonized because of economic reasons. They wanted to make money. Analyze the importance of the Virginia House of Burgesses, which we'll talk about. Explain the reasons for the growth of representative government and the institutions during the colonial period. And explain how religion and virtue contribute to the growth of representative government in the American colonies. So unlike the Spanish and French, the British colonies were not funded or strictly controlled by the king. They were created kind of, if you think of a stock today, if you invested in Coca-Cola stock or Nike stock, what that is it's a bunch of people giving a little bit of money to that company, hoping that they'll take that money and invest it into research and development, to maybe, if you're Nike, making better shoes. And through that research and development, and lots of other things that they're funding with that money, they'll make more money and the company will become more valuable. But if I invest in a stock, I own a part of that. And so these people did the exact same thing. They invested in these joint stock companies that would go overseas and hopefully bring home large profits that those people would then, they would make money on their original investment. Once a charter was signed from the king, the company could maintain a colony in the New World. And what is a colony? Well, a colony is basically an area outside of a main country that people go to and settle and develop, but it's a part of the country, but it's outside of the country. So it's owned by the country, but it's not on the mother country's actual original land, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, we'll explain it later on. So even though Roanoke is the first colony to kind of be established, it really wasn't when I say established, the first one to kind of be set up, it didn't last very long. So in fact, it didn't even last 3 years. And so Jamestown is what we think of as the first really established colony that survived. And the way that came about is in 1606, the Virginia Company was formed by a bunch of those investors, that joint stock company, who wanted to find gold in the New World. Remember, Spain had been bringing just tons and tons of gold back from Central and South America. And so the rest of the world is kind of taking notice as Spain is becoming the most powerful country in the world because of their colonies in Central and South America and all the gold that's coming from them. Everybody else kind of wants to get in on it. So if somebody came to you and you lived during that time and they said, hey, we're sending a ship or a bunch of ships over to this new territory, and if you give a certain amount of money, then if they find gold, we'll triple or quadruple or however many times. You'll get rich if you invest with us, and you'll make a lot of money off it. That's a very enticing and very attractive thing for people, and so they were more than willing to invest in these companies, and that's what happens with the Virginia Company. So in 1607, settlers founded Jamestown, which became the first permanent British colony in America. Jamestown was founded along the Chesapeake Bay in present-day Virginia. And a lot of our history in the United States takes place in Virginia. In fact, most of the Civil War, I would say probably 70%, maybe that's too much, but a lot of the Civil War was fought in Virginia. You have to remember that both Washington, D.C. is just outside of Virginia, and Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was actually in Virginia, so not very far apart from each other. So a lot of history is going to take place in Virginia. If you look at this picture and you think about possible advantages and disadvantages of this particular location, you can think of some. If you're looking at the picture, some of the advantages might be that it's close to water for ports, but that could also be a disadvantage if you think of the storms that come in on the eastern seaboard. But there might be other advantages and disadvantages. And you have to think, if all you know is what you see, there might be disadvantages that you don't even know about. And that's what happened with the Virginia colony. So settlers built a fort, but they struggled to survive in their first years in America. And one of the reasons why they struggled to survive is because, remember, the people who had funded them coming there had said, your number one goal, your number one mission is to find gold. And so they were out there trying to find gold instead of trying to figure out ways to survive. And what they really should have been doing was planting food so that they would have enough crops to survive. Instead, they were out there trying to find gold. And it really became a short-term thing. Hey, I'm going to come here, I'm going to find some gold, I'm going to get out of here. Instead of thinking long-term and establishing a way to get food year after year. You can see some of the details about the fort here. So settlers arrived looking for gold, so they didn't prepare to stay long in America, which is what I just said. They didn't plant crops and they faced starvation, which is not good. And obviously, if you're not preparing to survive and doing the things that you need to survive, and you're only looking for gold, that's not very smart, and it's going to cost those settlers. John Smith is going to come in and take control, and he's going to force settlers to farm. He's really famous for doing that. He comes in very strong-handed, and he says basically those who won't work won't eat, which is that quote right there. He who will not work will not eat, which is a pretty good philosophy if you're a bunch of people in the middle of nowhere trying to survive. Also, one of the things to remember is a lot of people who had come with the Virginia colony, Virginia company, they were kind of rich kids, I guess is a good way to put it. They were rich kids who'd never worked before, and so they were coming over just to try to find gold, and they really weren't into doing the hard labor that it takes to farm. So one of the disadvantages that they couldn't see when they got there was that Jamestown was kind of located on a swamp, and it didn't really look that way necessarily in the beginning, but when you have the tides that come in and out, if you've ever been to the ocean, the tide comes in and the tide comes out. And when you have a river, the tide from the ocean, that salt water will come into a river and kind of go up the river a little bit. And that's what happened with them in the Chesapeake Bay area. So they had this salt water, and they call that brackish water. And a lot of historians today believe that they were actually poisoning themselves, so slowly poisoning themselves by drinking the water where they settled. It was also located in a territory controlled by the Powhatan Indians, and that led to a lot of problems. Actually, in 1622, they had some peace with that tribe, but in 1622, the successor, one of the leaders died, and that successor attacked the Virginia colony, the Chesapeake colony, and killed 1/3 of the Virginia colonists. And so in retaliation, the Virginians, they basically came in and burned the Indians' crops. They destroyed all the Indians' crops and said, if you ever attack us again, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take away all of your ways to survive. And so that kind of scared the natives into respecting the Virginia colony and not doing that again. So after the Jamestown colonists failed to find gold, because there's not any gold on the eastern seaboard, no one ever came in and found gold. And in fact, that's why it was settled so late. If you look at what was settled first in North and South America and Central America, it's really, you're going to be looking at South and Central America, where there was these massive civilizations that had been mining gold for quite a while. And so they become settled first. The areas in North America are not really settled until later on, until this time period, and they realize still, there's no gold here, so we have to figure out a different way to make money. And so John Rolfe comes in and he introduces tobacco, and tobacco is a crop that wasn't present in Europe, but it was in North America. And it was something that, as we know today, tobacco is addictive. And so once people in Europe started to have tobacco, they started to realize, hey, I want more, because of that the addictive properties in tobacco. And so John Rolfe sees this as an opportunity, and he says, we may not have gold here, but we have a form of gold. We have tobacco. If we can grow enough tobacco, which they don't have in Europe and they can't grow there, or they can't grow very well, if we can grow it here, then we can make a lot of money off of that. And so that becomes the way that the Virginia colonists make money for quite a while. So tobacco becomes so profitable that colonists planted more and built large plantations and expanded to find new land for farming. So it's kind of the way that these colonies expanded. They're looking for new places to plant tobacco. And there's a funny story about Jamestown. They said one of the people that visited there said that he tried to walk down the street, and even in the middle of the town, the street that ran down the middle of the town, there was tobacco growing in the street. You had to kind of dodge these tobacco plants because it was so profitable. They were looking for anywhere and everywhere that they could grow it and maintain it. So due to the success of tobacco, the Jamestown settlement expanded into the Virginia colony. So it starts as the Jamestown settlement, and I've kind of been referring to it as the Virginia colony, the Chesapeake colony, Jamestown colony. It starts as Jamestown, and eventually it will become the Virginia colony. So we think of it from now on, we're going to think of it as the Virginia colony, but just understand that Jamestown is what started that. Tobacco created a need for field labor to plant and pick the tobacco. So people had to plant the tobacco and pick the tobacco. That's manual labor, and that needed to you needed to have people to do that manual labor. So to meet the demand for workers, landowners in Virginia used indentured servants from England. So what is an indentured servant? An indentured servant was someone who didn't have enough money to make the journey over to Virginia from Europe, but they could talk to someone who was rich and did have the money, and they would say, hey, if you'll pay for my way over, if a rich person was already going to Virginia and I'm a poor person, I would talk to that rich person and I would say, if you will pay my way to come over, I'll work for you for 6 years for free, for nothing. And so that's what would happen. They would pay for their way to come to the New World, and then to kind of pay them back for that, they would kind of be their servants for anywhere from 4 to 7 years. And they would do that back-breaking labor of planting and picking tobacco. In 1618, Virginia introduced the headright system, which gave 50 acres to anyone who brought an indentured servant to America. So they wanted, anytime you have a colony, they want more and more people to come. You have to have people to keep a colony going, and especially because so many of the people who are coming are dying. A lot of them are dying from things like disease and things like starvation and all kinds of different things, Indian attacks. So you have all these, thousands of people who are dying, and you have to have a steady amount of people who are settling. And so not only do they want people to settle, they want people to bring indentured servants. So to get them to do that, they have this headright system where they would give acreage to anyone who brought an indentured servant to America. Also, I forgot to mention, one of the things that they would do was the indentured servant, when they got out of servitude, sometimes they would give them land at the end of their service. So there was something in it for the indentured servant as well. That indentured servant knew at the end of their term of service, they would not only be released and be free, they would get a piece of land. And that's the bit, it's the American dream now to own land, and it was the dream then to own land as well. Especially coming from Europe, where everything is owned by families that go back for 1,000 years or something. Not that long at this point in time, but they'd go back for hundreds of years, these rich families. So the large population of poor people in Britain led thousands of people to immigrate as indentured servants by 1700, and you can see that from this map. Indentured servants worked hard, they were treated badly, and many died before their contracts ended. In addition to indentured servants, Virginia landowners also started to use African slaves. And it's really an interesting story how this happened, how this began to take place. There was a ship that was supposed to be bound for South America that ended up being diverted and ended up in the Jamestown area that had slaves in it. And that's actually how the first slaves ended up in Jamestown. In the mid-1600s, fewer indentured servants came to America as the British economy improved. As a result, African slavery replaced indentured servitude as the dominant labor system in Virginia. And there's a lot more to that I'm going to explain about why that happened, why it was, it went from indentured servitude to slavery. Because when you really think about it, it was actually a lot more expensive to buy slaves than it was to have an indentured servant. That was relatively inexpensive. And so we have to kind of think, why would people start to do that? Why would they start to purchase slaves instead of continuing the indentured service? And there's a reason, and I'm going to tell you guys in a little bit. Okay, African slaves were transported from Africa to America on slave ships across the Middle Passage. And again, if I use my pointer here, and I show you, this is, remember Portugal, it's right here, which I don't know why they don't tell you what Portugal is or have it there on the map. But Portugal had access to the Gold Coast of Africa. They also, because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, had access to what is now we see as Brazil. And so they were bringing slaves. They were trading with these these conquering tribes. These tribes would conquer other tribes of Africans. They would sell their people that they had captured to the Portuguese. Portuguese would bring them to Brazil. And eventually, because they started to work in places like sugar plantations and things like that, in the just all over, anywhere in this area here, they worked in all kinds of plantations and farming endeavors. And also, some of them worked in mining endeavors there as slaves. That becomes more popular with the Spain starts to do it as well, and then eventually you have a lot of countries taking place, or a lot of countries taking part in the slave trade. But it comes to British North America very late in that process. So as late as 1640, there were probably only 150 blacks in Virginia, and not all of them were slaves. So the slavery was not the way that we think about it back then. So one of the best examples of that is one of the first slave owners in the Virginia colony was actually black. His name was Anthony Johnson, and we know that because there was actually he actually had an indentured servant who was white, who he claimed was his slave, and he had a white person and a black person. He claimed that they were his permanent slaves. And that got taken to court. And so we have these court records that show us that. And he was actually a former indentured servant himself who had kind of risen within Virginia and made a name for himself. So the system that we now think of as chattel slavery, which is like a person owning another person forever, that only really took root after Bacon's Rebellion, and really kind of even after that, and you can kind of see from these numbers here. So, and we're going to talk about Bacon's Rebellion in slide 22, and it's really a crucial part to understand why slavery replaced indentured servitude. So in 1650, 300 blacks lived in Virginia. By 1680, the number had risen to 3,000. By 1704, it had risen to 10,000. And so you can see an example of a ship in the middle passage, really just terrible. There's stories about these Portuguese ships and other nations, and just horrible stories about the fact that sharks would follow these ships because they would just lay people side to side. They would be laying in their own filth. They would be treated terribly. And so a lot of them would die on the way, and they would just throw them overboard. And so these sharks would follow these ships, knowing that there would be these dead people being thrown overboard, which is just horrific. This is horrific in and of itself, but when you think about it in that context, it's even worse. This is the coffin position that was used below deck, so they would literally kind of stack people on top of each other. Just terrible. And again, you have the African captives being thrown overboard if they tried to mutiny or run away, or obviously you can't run away on a ship, but if they tried to take the ship over, or a lot of times if they had just died in the process. And then you have a slave auction upon arrival in America. And this is going to become much more commonplace again when we get into the 1700s. Really, when we're talking about the mid-1700s is really when slavery is kind of taking off, and the height of slavery really won't happen until we have the cotton industry take off with the cotton gin in 1820. By that time, the Constitution had eliminated international slave trade. I mean, they had said that that was still going on illegally, but the need for labor because of the cotton gin had made slavery really take off in the South. And when we talk about slavery, that's kind of what we think of. So here's the hierarchy of the Chesapeake Colony. You have owners of tobacco plantations are at the top of the society. Poor small-scale farmers were the largest class. Former indentured servants, both black and white. Remember, we don't have that form of slavery that we had yet at the beginning of the Chesapeake Society. Few women. There were not very many women in Virginia. So, like, if a woman was married, her husband would die. So she would. I mean, that was kind of just the way it happened. So, both children and wives. Children would end up having, multiple dads or multiple moms. Women would end up marrying multiple men after their husbands had died. Probably, a large percentage of even the kids passed away. So, not a lot of women to begin with, but if the husband died, then they would find another husband. Indentured servants were often mistreated, so they're kind of there, and then African slaves were at the bottom of society. Okay, so meeting of the Assembly in the settlement of Virginia. So it asks, why are these men gathered here? Virginia colonists needed laws to maintain order, but the British government was thousands of miles across the ocean. In 1619, Virginia formed the House of Burgesses, which was the first legislative assembly in America. Which was really important. They formed their own form of government. So it's a legislative assembly, meaning that it was people that represented cities or represented areas, represented different settlements, and they all came together and voted on things. It's really the original form of the government that we have today, which is very important, and that's important to know. The state of Texas wants you to know what the House of Burgesses was. Virginia was a royal colony, so it had a governor chosen by the king. So the king would choose someone to kind of be the governor over that land, but the House of Burgesses made the important decisions regarding tax and laws. And that, again, that's what we call salutary neglect, where England would basically say, well, we want all the profits from the colonies, but we don't necessarily want all the problems of the day-to-day issues that come along with that. So they left those day-to-day decisions to the House of Burgesses, and then they they profited off of it. But that's going to become a problem because people like to be free. They like to make their own decisions. And, if you try to take that away once you've given it to somebody, if your parents said, hey, you can stay up till 12 o'clock, and then, in a week they said, well, we're cutting your bedtime to 8 o'clock, you would not like that. So by England giving freedom right here, it's something that when they try to take it away later on, the colonists are not going to be happy about it. Even though the leaders of the House of Burgesses were elected, they were rich planters who didn't really represent the poor farmers of the colony. So former indentured servants in the Western Virginia suffered from low tobacco prices and frequent Indian attacks. And so what happened was these indentured servants would be released from indentured servitude, and then they would be given maybe a piece of land. Most of them were given a piece of land, and they said, okay, well, here's 20 acres or 30 acres, and now you can go and farm your own tobacco and make your own way. You can live out your dream. The only problem was that some of the things that the English government had done lowered the price of tobacco, and so rich tobacco owners who owned massive plantations, what they had to do was start making more of it and selling more and more and more tobacco because the price was so low. And so if you think about those little farmers who were former indentured servants, they were left with, hey, I can grow this small amount, but I can't make any money because the price of tobacco is so low because of these things that England had done. And so that's really, England had this Act of Trade and Navigation, and so that was an issue. So this leads poor farmers to revolt, and they're led by this guy, Nathaniel Bacon, who he blamed Virginia's governor for not protecting them, and he started a rebellion. And he basically comes into Jamestown and burns the place down. So you can see that they're burning it down. There again. So Bacon's rebellion proved to rich Virginians that slaves were better than indentured servants. So what they get out of this, here's what the rich get out of this. And I can tell you a lot of the details about Bacon's rebellion, but we don't really have time to go over it all. What it really boils down to is this. Rich Virginians said, if we bring these indentured servants over and eventually they're going to become free, what it does is it creates this kind of middle class of people who can rise up against us. And so we don't like that. We don't like these people who, if we give them a few acres of land, then they have this ability to rise up and revolt against us or do something like what happened in Bacon's rebellion. And so they said, I don't think that's a good idea. So because of that, they were less willing to take on indentured servants who would one day become free, and they were more likely to then purchase slaves who they had those slaves would never become free, and they would always have control over them. And that's where you get the idea of chattel slavery, where one person is owning another. All right, so hopefully that helps you understand how we get the Jamestown colony and how that becomes the Virginia colony, the Jamestown settlement, and how that becomes the Virginia colony, and you know a little bit about Chesapeake Society by learning about this. All right, until next time, thanks.